Hi, this is Chris Pells. In this video we're going to learn how to build a custom profile provider for ASP.NET. Many times the standard profile provider that comes with ASP.NET membership is sufficient for your needs, but then again there may be times where we would like to create a custom profile provider either to store your profile data in a different kind of database, or you may still want to store it in SQL Server, which is what the standard membership provider does, but rather than the regular profile table, you'd like to create some of your own tables to store the profile data in a more granular manner so you can do reporting or other things. So that's what we're going to do here. First thing we need to do is to create a class library project that will contain the logic for our custom profile provider. So let's go up here to our empty solution and add a new project. We'll add a class library type project and let's call this profile provider sample. And let's just store it in this folder here. Now we're going to need a couple of references in our class library project, some other assemblies. So I'll just view all files so you can see the references that we're creating here. So we're going to add references to two different assemblies. The first one will be system.configuration and the other one will be system.web. Now in order to create a custom profile provider, we need to inherit from the class called profile provider. So let's take our class here and inherit from system. There we go. System.web.profile provider. Now when I hit the enter key here, what you're going to see is all of the abstract classes that we need to implement for our custom profile provider. And as you can see, there's a fair number of them here that we have to implement. So in the interest of time, because we have quite a bit that we have to cover on this topic, what I'm going to do is bring in a class here that I've created ahead of time which has all the code for these methods, and then we'll go through and review what the code does in each of the methods. So I'll go over here and just refresh our project, and there's the class that I want to bring in. So we'll just include that in the project. And now let's open that up and take a look at it. So what I've done here in our class is I've called it HDI Profile Provider, put it in its own namespace. As you can see, it still inherits from the System Web Profile Provider class, which is required to do. And then I've added a few imports up here so we don't have to type fully qualified namespaces in a number of different places. So we'll flip back over here to SQL Server. And what I've done is just create a database in SQL Server called HDI Profile Provider. And I've installed ASP.NET membership in here, or the membership tables. What we're interested in are these two tables down here at the bottom that I've created. One is called Profiles and the other is called Profile Data. Now Profiles has a number of columns in it. Now you don't have to have these column names literally, but you do need to have columns that store a unique identifier, a username, an application name, whether or not the user is anonymous, as well as the date of the last activity, because the implementation of the profile provider class requires that you be able to store that data and do certain operations that relate to that data. So there's a pretty standard set of columns. Now the other table that we have here is called Profile Data, and this is the table in which I will store the specific profile data that I want for my particular application. And in this case I have a unique identifier for each row of profile data, the foreign key profile ID pointing back to the profile table, and what I'm going to store in my profile here is GMT, or essentially what time zone is the user in, as well as where are they located, what is the latitude and longitude of their location. Now let's take a look at the implementation logic for our provider. The first abstract method that we implemented is initialize, and what initialize does is read some values from the web.config file and store them locally. Most notably, up here in class variables are connection string and application name. Now let's take a look at the get properties and set property value methods. And these two methods, as the names imply, get the values for our profile or set the values for our profile. So let's take a look at how we get the values for our profile. So what we get inbound to this method is the application context as well as a collection of properties that we can set. So essentially what we have to do here in our method is go off and get the values for each of the properties, in this case from the profile data table, and store them in a collection of values corresponding to those properties. Now the first thing we're going to do here starting on line 95 is start to interact with some of the user information from the application context. So here what we want to do is find out, and store the username and whether or not the user is authenticated, because we're going to need to store that in some of our tables. And then we're going to go down and we're going to set up a stored procedure over in SQL Server that we're going to call to select the profile data from the database. We're going to add a few parameters down here starting on line 103 where we're passing in the username, application name, and whether or not the user is anonymous, because those are the three criteria that allow us to uniquely identify a profile for a user in the profiles table. Then down here on line 107 we're initializing a new instance of the settings property value collection, which you can see up here on line 93 is the return argument from this required from this method. Then we're going to go down here in our try block. We're going to open the connection, execute a SQL data reader. Then we're going to loop through each of the properties that were sent inbound to this method, and for each one of those we're going to establish what the property is by looking at the name of the property. In this case here we see GMT, lat, and long, and if we find that property then we're going to take the value from the SQL data reader and assign it to the property value. And notice we're creating a new instance of a local variable for the settings property value class, which is where we're storing the property value. And then down here on line 131, as we iterate through each of the properties, we're taking this instance of the settings property value class and storing it in the settings value collection, which is what we're ultimately returning from this method. Now some of these names may be a little confusing here, but to help you, essentially what's happening is there's one collection coming inbound to the method which has all the properties, and then there's a separate collection that's being returned from the method, and in that collection we have each of the values for the property. So then when we're all done down here, you'll see we're returning the collection of values that we have created. So let's collapse up this get properties method, and let's go down and look at how we would set the properties. Now what's happening here is essentially the reverse of what we just saw in get property values. We're getting inbound to this method in application context, and essentially the same collection that we returned from the get property values method up here is being passed back to us, and what we need to do then is to take each of the values in this collection and store them back in the database. Now to do that we get some of the same information that we did when we retrieved the property values. Get the username, whether or not they're authenticated. We set up a stored procedure here that we're going to call to save the data. We add some parameters which will allow us to uniquely identify the user for saving the data. And then we iterate through each of the inbound property value settings, and we add that value to a parameter passed inbound to the stored procedure. Then when we're done with setting up the parameters, we're just opening the connection, executing the query to save the data in the database. Okay, let's flip back over here to SQL Server. Here are the two tables, the profile data and the profiles that we saw a little bit ago. Let's go down in here to the stored procedures. Many of these procedures that have the ASP.NET _ prefix are with the membership provider. Let's go down here. Here are the various stored procedures that we're using for our custom profile provider. Now for getting our property values for our profile, we're using the profile data select, and that stored procedure passes in 3 values which allow us to uniquely identify the profile. And before returning the data so we can store it in the profile in our code, here on line 21 it's calling a separate stored procedure which is updating the last activity column in our profile record, which, as you recall, is up here, right here, last activity. Now the other stored procedure that we're using to set the